Good afternoon. I want to acknowledge that I'm presenting, talking on the land of the Burra Matagal people of the Eora Nation, and to acknowledge any elders here, past, present, future, and to also acknowledge the shared heritage shared between Australia, the United States, and Canada around genocide and colonization, physical, emotional, spiritual colonization against Indigenous people. And so I just aware of that as I stand here and join you all this afternoon. I get the coveted end of the day spot. And I get to come up after those young people talking so powerfully. So right now I'm just feeling like another professional talking head coming up and talking to you. And it's just awe-inspiring to listen to them talk. And it reminds me of a few days I spent a number of years ago doing a multi-day tour with a group of young people who were getting counseling, who were in a project in Atlanta, Georgia, which this program, which was working with immigrant families, Latino families, and working with them in a way that was culturally safe. They started out by working with the women who were abused, and the women said, "What about our children?" So they started doing programming for their children, all in the same church, all in the same building. And then they said, what about their fathers? What about our partners? Because we want to be able to keep our families together and be safe. We shouldn't have to leave our communities. We shouldn't have to leave our homes. We shouldn't have to leave our families to want to be safe. So they started running groups for men's behavior change groups right there in the same place. And these young people were on tour. We were giving talks to child protection workers, statutory child protection workers in the United States. And the days were interesting, put it that way, because in the morning there were researchers who got up there and said, men don't change. It's not worth it. The research tells us that we shouldn't be working with men and it's dangerous and not important, not worth our energy and time. And then the young people came on in the panels in the afternoon and said things like, my father who's abusive knows I'm here, and he's very supportive. And so their lived experience was very different than what the researchers or the professionals were talking about. So these young people remind me of that experience where the educated, I'm going to put that in quote, folks were missing the point. So what I'm hoping this afternoon I could do, and then the master class tomorrow will extend this when I join folks in a conversation. But this afternoon, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about what it means to think about domestic violence perpetration as a parenting choice. And I think that as I talk, you'll see the connections between a lot of things that Kate talked about today, about a framework for group supervision, that Shelley and Alan talked about in terms of dignity-driven practice, and the importance of really having a solid foundation when we start talking about domestic and family violence, that we have this very strong framework that really gets us to think about our work with the entire family, including the perpetrator, but maybe even more deeply in some ways, gets us to reflect on how we think about the work with boys and men in our practice and the way we work, and the gaps that we've been handed by institutional practice, by our education potentially, that really makes it harder for us to work with the entire family, to be good allies to adult and child domestic violence survivors, to work in a culturally safe way, and to really reflect upon that. And so what I'd like to invite you to do is as I'm kind of laying out a few things, to think about one particular family that you've worked with, to get them in your mind, a family with domestic violence that you may know something about. And so as I go through some bits of pieces of information, that you really kind of start mapping it onto your lived experience. And to think about, well, what did I do well with this family? What could I have done differently? And to really frame it in a larger context, which is using the language that Shelley and I talk about, the social response to domestic violence in the child protection, child welfare world has been one of failure to protect. That the primary lens that often has been looked at when we're used to look at families when we're dealing with domestic violence in a child-centered child protection perspective is that the primary issue is that the adult survivor, usually the mom, failing to protect the children. And in doing that, we've actually put ourselves in opposition to the most natural ally we have in that family, which is the adult domestic violence survivor. We've actually made her, in many ways, a bigger problem than we have the domestic violence perpetrator. And I remember talking to this is going back about 15 or 20 years, actually, and I've been doing this work for about 30 at this point, working with child protection for about 20, and really always take the opportunity in this kind of setting and other settings to talk about how child protection has one of the hardest jobs in our community and one of the least recognized challenges, group of people with challenges working with families, because everybody loves children, but not everybody has the responsibility to sign their name to a piece of paper today saying that their kids are safe. Not everybody has to go into a home where the police often go with weapons or other forms of protection to check on the safety of the kids. And so I really want to acknowledge everybody in the room for the work that you do with families. So working in this environment for a number of years, I've had a lot of conversations with social workers, and one right now sticks out at me about this framework. And this manager was talking, and this supervisor and team leader was talking about with conversations she had with this mom and how she was lying to her face about what had happened. And she couldn't understand why she was lying. And she was so angry she was being lied to. And I stopped her and said, "Can I ask you a question?" And this goes back to this curiosity that Kate was talking about earlier. "Can I ask you a question? Are you angrier at this mom than you are at the domestic violence perpetrator who's hurting her?" And she stopped, and she didn't have an answer because she didn't say anything, because the answer was she was angry at the mother, more angry at the mother than she was the perpetrator. And she didn't have this framework of acts of resistance. She didn't have this way to understand that not talking openly about the violence was a form of protection for this woman and for her children. And that also that she was probably at this point, going back 20 years ago, not really taught about how to engage and think about men's roles in families, and to think about how domestic violence perpetrators impact child and family functioning. So I'm going to try to offer you a couple of practice tips as we go through this 15 minutes of me presenting, and then we'll have about 10 minutes or so for questions and answers. So if you've got something that you want to ask about, or you have a problem with something I'm saying, please write it down so you can remember it. But the first practice tip I'm going to offer you, if you want to practice in what we refer to as a domestic violence-informed way, or a perpetrator pattern-based approach, which I'm going to talk a little bit about. If you want to think about that, then one of the things you want to think about, can I answer this question on the cases that I have that involve domestic violence? What's the perpetrator's pattern of behavior, and what's been its impact on child and family functioning? Can you describe, if I sat down with you and we were talking about a case and worked with a family, and a family you knew well, and I said to you, tell me about the perpetrator's pattern of coercive control, tell me about not just his physical violence, but other things that he's done, threats, intimidation, emotional abuse. Again, thinking about some of those things that were listed in Alan and Shelley's presentation about humiliation. What has he done to humiliate her? To control, or the sexual abuse, the physical abuse. And if I asked you to tell me what you know about what he's done to harm the kids, physical abuse to the kids, using the kids as weapons against her, what he's done to interfere with the parent-child relationship. If I asked you to describe his behaviors, and then I said, what has he done not during the most recent incident, but over the course of their relationship? What could you tell me? And the good news is that when I sit down with workers, there's so much they can tell me about those things. The bad news often is very little that's written down in the case file. And sometimes not even their supervisor knows these things because it's not what the supervisor or team leader has asked them. So if I sat down with you and asked you that, what could you tell me? And then if I said to you, now describe to me how those behaviors have impacted child and family functioning, what would you tell me? How did it affect their housing? How did it affect the day-to-day function of the family? How did it affect meals? How did it affect medical care? How did this perpetrator affect the mom's ability to go and get counseling for herself or the children? Did these behaviors make the family stronger or weaker? So if you want to look at one of the foundational pieces when we talk about domestic violence-informed practice in the child welfare setting, you want to be asking these questions and thinking about this framework. And it's the foundation, and it's really interesting listening to Alan and Shelley talk about this earlier because I think we're coming at the same thing. They talk about, I want you to hear the similarities, because sometimes there's an overload about models and approaches, and I like to try to help people kind of weave things together. And so when I talk about and say, without that information, you can't contextualize the survivor's decision-making and behavior, I'm saying the same thing they were saying this morning, but coming at it from a different angle. If you can't describe those behaviors, how do you tell the story about what the kid's not going to school in a way that holds the perpetrator's behavior accountable? If all you can say is, Dad's been arrested twice, and we had 3 open child protection cases on the family related to domestic and family violence, if that's all you can say, then you're describing the bureaucratic interventions. You're describing a systems-level intervention. But it's not until you can sort of bring together and think about, what do I know about what this person has done? And again, I think so much of you heard this morning about response-based practice is about behaviors. And I love your model that Alan and Shelley are sitting in the front row. I love that model because it's so much about asking questions about the facts, asking questions about the behavior. What did he do? What has he done? When you say that he's isolated you, or the mom's become isolated, that doesn't tell you about his behaviors. It tells you a piece of her experience, but it doesn't tell you what he's done. And so I want to give you an example. And some of you may know that we've been very involved with Kathy Humphries here in Australia. And we did the Patricia Project together. We joined their Patricia Project. We did Invisible Practices. And this has let us look at child protection practice across Australia in a number of different states. One of the case examples there really kind of jumped out at me, which was this father of these kids who did meth, did ice, and part of the way he was abusive was he would take the kids from the home, call up the mother and say, unless you give me money for drugs, I won't give the kids back to you. Okay? And I want you to think about that because this is a behavior, these are his biological kids, that he's probably not going to get arrested for. But meanwhile, the kids are terrified. They're crying, they're screaming. Mom is terrified because she doesn't know if he's threatening to kidnap them, kill them, take them away forever. And so eventually in this scenario that he leaves them with his parents, physically safe. But I want you to think about this for a second. How does that one action change the way that family functions? If you were that mother, how would you respond? Going back to connect it, what would be your acts of resistance going forward? Just based on that one incident, would you feel comfortable leaving the kids alone with him to go out to the store? So now all of a sudden you're taking the kids to the store with you, and your job just got harder. You're taking the kids places where maybe they don't need to be and then lying to people about why you didn't leave them home with their own father. Your work gets harder. And so when we talk to survivors about that, we assess what's going on. We can't use an incident-based framework. We have to use a pattern-based framework to really understand as best we can, that we bring that to our work with the families, to not understand that this is an incident of violence because we got called because the police called us for an incident of violence, but to really look deeply, be curious about, well, what is the course of control here and what's the impact on the family? And so one of the things that when we talk about engaging this question about good assessment in domestic violence cases, we talk about engaging this question about working with families well and doing good assessments, we really need to be thinking about through this pattern-based lens, which means really looking at what the domestic violence perpetrator has done and what they're capable of doing. And to really understanding that their choices and behaviors matter to child and family functioning. So I told you I would give you a piece of that and then a piece of this wider conversation. I'm going to move back and forth. So when I've been doing this work now all over the world, when I sit down with audiences, I become, particularly child welfare audiences, I've become particularly attuned to the fact that this challenge we have working with men who are violent and working around men's violence in families rests on the back of another issue, at least one other issue, there's many, which is that many of us haven't received the appropriate training or support to work with non-violent men in our practice. So I want to test something out here and I want to talk about something. And I want to talk about gender. So raise your hand, I'm going to try to get a feel for it, if you took a course in uni on male socialization or male parental development. Raise your hands and look around the room to see. Okay, I'm not seeing any hands really. I've got these lights blinding me, but I don't think I'm seeing any hands. Am I missing anybody? Okay. So just think about that for a second. Now I want you to think about something a little more realistic in some sense. I mean, I know that's usually the answer I get. How many of you did a field placement or an internship, a practicum, whatever it was called, where you did some of your practical learning in human services and social work? How many of you did it with a population that was primarily male? Raise your hand. And hold them up there for a second. It's a big room, and I don't want to hurt my neck swinging back and forth too quickly. I'm going to do a really rough count. About 10 people over there, about 5 more over there, maybe 10, that's 25. Let's make that 10 over here, another 10 over here. I've lost track of the math. Okay, put your hands down, it's okay. Let's say it's 50 to 75 people in this room, which would be fitting. So that would be 5 to 7.5%, 8%, let's say 10%, which is often the top ceiling in settings like this that I'll get. And if I had a chance to call it out, it would probably be homeless men, veterans, adult or youth justice, maybe mental health, but it covers most of it. Substance abuse would be another one. So I want you to think about this for a second, which means in this room, 90%, which is not any different from anywhere else in Australia or the US or Canada, the UK, 90% of the staff here, the practitioners here, have received no formal training in working with a male population. I want you to think about that for a second. And I want you to think about whether in your communities, if you have agencies that say, we work with children and families, if they actually work with children and families, or they work with women and children. So I want you to start thinking about the challenges that we've all been handed through our institutional systems around whether we've been supported around asking the question when we work with families, what's the role of the male caregiver in the family, and what actions does he engage in that strengthen or weaken the family? And to really begin to understand that that's just a variation on what I said earlier about a deviant-informed perspective, which is, what's the perpetrator done to strengthen or weaken child and family functioning? What's his behavior pattern? So I want to offer you my second tip here, which is to start thinking about what would it mean to sit down in families and to explore with them not whether the dad is a breadwinner or not, but to start asking questions and be curious about what does your partner do to help the family function more smoothly on that given day? What does your partner do to strengthen the family? Again, remember these questions are behavioral. These aren't questions like, does he love the kids or not? And these are not questions that are very value-laden in the sense of, is he a good dad or not? These are the questions that we want to be asking when somebody says, he's a good dad, he loves his kids, that our next question could be, I really hear that. Describe to me what he does that makes you feel like that's true. And this is not a setup question because you're working with a lot of families where there are a number of good dads, that they're working there to do things. In fact, I work with families where the issue was mom substance abuse and dad was actually the primary caregiver and doing a lot to keep the family together. So this is a generic model about increasing capacity as practitioners to work with families in general. And these are questions that don't necessarily always involve working with the father. They could be a question you ask the mom, you can ask the kids. Describe to me what your mom's boyfriend does here in the household. What does that look like? What does he do to make you feel safe? What does he do to make you feel loved? What does he do to show you that he loves your mom? And these are questions that you can ask that will give you really good information. So when we think about being domestic violence informed, we want to be thinking about this piece around how we think about men in general. Because if we don't reflect or be critical around our own practice with families around male caregivers, and when I say fathers, it could be boyfriends who are unrelated to the kids, it could be a grandfather, it could be an uncle, it could be another male relative. I really want you to hear this very broadly. But when we're thinking about this, to really understand that we want to try to engage families as they understand themselves. And if we're not working with or about the father in the family, then we may be missing some very critical parts of this. So what we found as we did this work that kept coming back over and over again, and I'm about to show you a very high-tech visual aid in a second, which some of you may have seen if you saw me 3 years ago do this at a research and practice conference here in Sydney. But I want you to think about this because I think it's really critical to how we put things together. That as I worked with families who work with families, I'm going to say something that I think is most people in the room know is that our expectations of men and women as parents are very different. And so I'm going to hopefully, oh, look, the mic just came with me. It was like magic. I stepped away from the podium and I still have a microphone. So you should be able to see me and from all parts of the room, and you've got the videos there. So I'm going to put up a hand here, and I'm going to put another hand here. And I want to tell you is this right hand is our expectations of women as parents. You only get one guess about what the left hand represents. Okay? And I really want you to think about this, and it really goes back to what you guys were saying. It ties back into the dignity-driven practice and the importance of having a gender analysis, an empower analysis, and to really think about a social response. Because what I'm talking about actually right now is not what families are like. What I'm talking about is how we approach families with our own lens. This is about our perceptions, our expectations of women as parents, and this left hand is about our expectations of men as parents. And so when you think about this, and you start thinking about when you go into homes, who do you ask if the kids are medically up to date? Moms or dads? Okay? If you start thinking about who you expect to go to parent-teacher conferences or school conferences for the children, who do you really expect to show up? Okay? So do you understand where I'm going with this? If there's recommendations that are being made for kids to go to counseling or be on medication, who do we expect to follow through on those recommendations? Moms or dads? Okay? So we're talking generically and stereotypically, and a lot of this, by the way, the perpetrator pattern-based approach applies to same-sex relationships as well, and I'm happy to answer questions about that. But I found that it's really, from my perspective, irresponsible, and damaging to talk in a generic way about parents. Because the truth is, this is not going to be written down in any of our policies, but it is so much about the culture of our practice. And so what this means, I'm going to put my hands down. Hopefully you remember what I was doing. And what will happen, by the way, is if I come back next year, people will say, oh, you're that crazy American who stood in front of us like this for like 10 minutes. And I remember that. And this is all people remember, by the way. And this is part of the reason why I do this, is it's memorable that I'm standing in front of you doing yoga and getting away with it. Is that when we talk about this, it has profound implications for our day-to-day practice. And what that means is that when men show up on time or at all for their visits with their kids, he's a great dad. What it means is that when the kids aren't going to counseling, what we write down may be, mom wasn't able to get the kids to counseling. I still remember a case where dad was violent, he'd been drinking, we'd been involved, child welfare had been involved, and there was a recommendation for dad, for the 8-year-old kid to go to counseling. And he didn't go because dad didn't want him to go. Fast forward, dad's arrested, he's out of the house, and mom and the child goes to counseling. Fast forward again, dad comes back into the house. Within 2 weeks, the counseling stopped. What the note in the file said was, mother and child have become non-compliant with counseling. Words matter. Language matters. You heard it from Kate. You heard it from Shelley and Alan. And again, I want you to really think about how different it would have been if that said some version of based on talking to the family or exploring it. But to me, it's obvious that fathers return to the house and his either active threats or interference or his presence stopped mom and the kids from going to counseling. It wasn't safe anymore. But instead, she and the child were labeled as non-compliant. This is the situation where if he's walking across the visitation center floor and he's cradling the baby's arms, he's a great dad, just by doing that. And so what this happens is this translates in the way we talk and think about moms and dads. It's the way we kind of approach things. So I really want you to start thinking about, what would it mean for me if I really started looking at the gender bias I might be bringing to the way I approach families, the way I talk to them, my expectations of mothers and fathers, and what would it mean to increase my curiosity about the cases that I'm working on right now, about what the male caregiver is doing to strengthen or weaken the family functioning. Because what I'll offer you is probably what's also missing is places where you're missing those strengths. And this is really important because when we look at this issue of becoming domestic violence informed, we really want to be thinking about that our goal is to focus on safety and well-being of the children, the strengthening of the family, not about relationship status and where people are living. In the past, we've focused on is the couple together or not. And in many cases, we've said if the couple's not together anymore, there's no more domestic violence danger to the kids, which is patently not true. What if he goes on to be in another relationship and the kids are with him on weekends and he abuses the new partner? Isn't he putting the kids in danger there? What if in post-separation, he stalks his partner? He becomes more violent. What if the court grants her custody and then he attempts to murder the kids as a way to get back to her? We can't practice as if the relationship ending automatically makes the kids safe. We can't practice as if the relationship ending is the answer, because part of what we do, by the way, when we do that is we start looking to the mom and say, you can make the kids safe by leaving the relationship. Why aren't you doing that? We look at her and say, well, we have expectations. She's the mother. She should fix this. If she really loved her kids, if she understood the violence was hurting the kids, if she wasn't picking him over the kids. Do these things sound familiar? If she wasn't picking him over the kids, then she'd just make the right choice. And going to the question that Alan answered at the very end, The most insidious form of victim blaming that's coming forward right now in some sense is she's a trauma survivor and she doesn't know any better. We can't expect any more from her. And so when we engage in domestic violence-informed practice, when we look to shift this, we start thinking about things a little bit differently. And I'm going to show you a couple of slides. My staff, if they were here, would be laughing because I'm about 2/3 of the way through the presentation without showing you any of the slides. So I'm just going to flip through a couple of things just that are informational, and you can see some of the places we've been working in the last few years. And the model is really the target audience for our work is professionals, you guys. It's not the families, because we really believe in the work that you're doing to shape outcomes for families and improve safety and well-being. And I'm not going to spend a ton of time here, but I just want to say to you that you can go to the literature and really kind of connects back in to what I've been talking about, which is it's stronger in many ways to use a family functioning lens to talk about the intersection of domestic violence and children than to just use, did the kids see it, did they hear it, were they physically in danger? You want to be thinking about coercive control, and you want to be thinking about actions taken to harm the kids, and you want to be thinking about what all this means for child and family functioning. One of the interesting things as before I get to some of the tools or some of the other things to use is that two of the stats on there are really, actually all of them are important, but I'm going to highlight just a couple of them. One is the vast majority of these kids still have contact with their fathers. And I want you to think about something for a second. When we talk about a perpetrator pattern-based approach, we use a pattern-based approach when we talk about sex offenders. How do I know that? Because we look beyond the targeted victims of their sexual abuse to say, is this person a danger to other children? So if he targeted his stepchildren, is he a danger to his biological children? Is he a danger to stranger children? That's a pattern-based approach. What we do in domestic violence cases is say, oh, the couple's not together. We use a relationship-based assessment lens or a location or geographic-based assessment lens. We say, oh, he's out of the house. The kids can have access to him as long as the mom and him are not together anymore. But I want you to think about that for a second, especially since that we know that many of these fathers have ongoing contact with those kids. So if you've got a family right now where the father was violent towards the mother, and the kids are having regular contact with him unsupervised, how did you determine that that was safe contact for those children? I'm not saying it isn't, by the way. But I want you to ask about, as a practitioner, how did you go about assessing the safety of those kids having contact with their father? Now compare that to a child sexual abuse case. Nobody would be thinking about allowing that contact of those kids without there being a thorough assessment and determination if that contact was safe. So I want you to think about how we have been handed a system where we think about, oh, domestic and family violence is something that happens between the adults, not what domestic violence perpetrators do to child and family functioning due to the survivor, the adult survivor, due to the entire family. And what I'm going to suggest to you is that you can't be abusing your kid's mother without having impact on the children and the family functioning, even if the kids don't see it. Because maybe what happens is she loses her job, and that affects the kids. I want you to see we're going to talk about multiple pathways to harm in a few minutes. So contact stats are really important to understand that these guys are not going away. And that children and often the adult survivor want us to work with him safely to improve his parenting. That domestic violence is often associated with child death. In New South Wales, there was a child death study done out of the Office of the Senior Practitioner that showed that when kids died, 61% of those cases had domestic violence in them as a factor. And most of those are neglect deaths, not abuse deaths. So we really have to expand out the way we understand how domestic violence perpetrators' behavior connects to the death of kids, particularly neglect deaths. And that the Canadian study, the bottom right-hand corner, 34% of substantiated CPS cases, that's a Canadian stat, the DV was part of the primary maltreatment. We see numbers higher than this, 43% in Ohio of child protection cases of domestic violence in them. Anecdotally, when I look at cases, I think the number is about 80%. that domestic violence is a meaningful factor in the case. It may not be an immediate safety factor, but it's an immediate factor, or it's a relevant factor in terms of the kids' outcomes. So what we're hoping to do by becoming DV informed is to move away from things that are often described as domestic violence destructive, which is working out case plans with survivors that make her responsible for the perpetrator's behavior. Case plans or case agreements where the survivor says, I will guarantee the kids aren't exposed to more violence, is domestic violence destructive, which means it actually can increase danger or push that person away from services. If I've been asked to guarantee the kids aren't exposed to more violence, I'm being asked to control somebody else's behavior. If I'm being asked to control somebody's behavior, my acts of resistance may involve not calling the police. They may involve lying to you. They may involve letting the perpetrator in when he comes in to the house or comes to the house in violation of order because I'm too scared to call because I'm afraid I'm going to lose the kids. So I'm going to try to manage it on my own without your help. So domestic violence destructive can be these things where we make the survivor responsible for what the perpetrator's done. That's kind of a good example. When we move around from that to domestic violence competent and proficient, we start seeing more perpetrator pattern-based behavior on our part in terms of the way we think about it. And for us, we tie this together with these safe and together model principles, which means that we have the ability to talk about and think about that keeping the kids safe and together with the adult survivor isn't just a matter of justice, which it is, but we have the ability to articulate that it's child-centered from the point of view of physical and emotional safety. It's child-centered from the idea of helping the kids heal from trauma, because we know that just having even one supportive, connected parent can be really helpful for kids coping with and healing from the trauma of violence and abuse. And that also that often that parent is often a form of a source of stability and nurturance. More recently, and I just kind of, before I go further down the list, we've even started using those same three things, safety and healing from trauma and stability and nurturance, to fine-tune case planning with perpetrators. And I think trying to tie this back to dignity-driven practice, I'm in complete agreement with Alan and Shelley that you can talk to perpetrators in a way that is about their dignity, especially if you're really grounded in this pattern-based approach and a focus on the behaviors that have harmed the family, and keep a behavioral focus on what should change. So if you start asking yourself questions, what does he need to do differently? Or if you're asking it to him, what do you need to do differently so that your kids experience greater safety, physical and emotional? What do you need to do to help your kids heal from trauma? And I know that's a stretch, but it's really useful for all of us to think about that if he's a parent responsible for the well-being of his children, then it's reasonable to engage him in this question about not only has your violence hurt your kids, and that's a safety issue, but if you're a parent, you're responsible for their mental health, their well-being, their functioning in the world. And again, if we don't ask that, we're back to this gender double standard. If we're not expecting that of him, then we're actually putting more burden on the survivor than we are on the perpetrator. And then lastly, to be able to ask the question, what's the perpetrator doing to increase stability and nurturance in the family? Now, that may mean that he's not in the home, actually, because he's unable to be part of a nurturing environment. But these kind of questions really help guide us when we work both with the survivor and the perpetrator, because, for instance, if we help somebody who's a domestic violence perpetrator get sober, we get them involved with a substance use program, an AOD program, and they get clean and sober, if they are continuing on their abusive track, then what happens is they will start saying, look at me, I got sober, she's still drinking, give me the kids. And his sobriety becomes another weapon against her. That isn't part of helping the kids heal from trauma. That isn't part of helping the kids be safer. That isn't part of creating stability and nurturance. So when we're thinking about this, that those three pieces there in that first line can really help us guide the work with both survivors and kids, with perpetrators. The second principle is around partnering with the non-offending parent as the default position. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, but when I do work with team leaders and I train them to coach their workers around domestic violence-informed practice, is I tell them to give guidance to their workers, which is go out and assume that the adult survivor was safety planning for the kids before you ever showed up. No matter what it looks like, go in with that assumption. And I think this goes back very well to what you heard this morning, which is that assume that a resistance is occurring even if you don't see it, even if what you see looks like something else. And that remember the curiosity that is there to kind of partner with and understand. But if you go out with this assumption, so again, giving you this third or fourth kind of practice tip, go out looking for that person's strengths. No matter what it looks like on the outside, look for their protective capacities, look for their resistance, look for them looking to keep their kids safe. And I remember I was in Queensland doing a workshop a few years ago, and this woman who actually was a domestic violence survivor, she disclosed this to me in the workshop, talked about, we did this pivoting exercise that we do. And it says pivot to the perpetrator that was mentioned at the beginning. And she said, well, I've got this mom who she's not doing anything to protect the kids, and I'm really concerned. I said, okay, so this is me, I don't know this family, this is me trusting the approach, trusting the reality of what goes on in these families. I'll say, tell me what you know that she's done to promote the kids' safety, the kids healing from trauma, the stability and nurturance. And she goes, well, nothing. She keeps handing the 3-year-old off to the father by himself, and I'm scared for the safety of the 3-year-old with the dad. I said, well, tell me why she does that. Well, actually, what I asked her next was, I actually persisted and said, tell me what you know about what she's done to keep the kids safe. By repeating the questions, it's me trusting that the worker knew something and the worker could explain it and just needed help articulating it. So I said, what else do you know about what she's done to keep the kids safe or promote their well-being or help them heal from trauma? She said, well, they have a kid in the NICU, the Neo-Intensive Care Unit. And I said, okay, and she never misses any time. When she can be there and it's visiting hours with the kid, she doesn't miss any time, she said. I said, great. And then she said, even though he doesn't want her to go there. So by persisting, by asking the questions, that she started uncovering in her own knowledge that this mother was persisting in visiting the most vulnerable child, despite the fact he was the abusive father didn't want her to go. And then what she told me was, oh, and he keeps her up at night. And when she shows up for visits to the hospital, she falls asleep. And the nurse thinks she's nodding off and doing drugs. And all of a sudden, the handing off of the 3-year-old started looking different because this was the only way she could get the time she needed to spend with the newborn. And she all of a sudden really understood very differently what was going on with this woman. And I want you to imagine after that how her conversation with this woman would have been very different. But this all comes out of from this trust and knowledge and experience that if we can get out of the way of our own professional arrogance and assume that that mom is safety planning for herself and her kids, and we go in with that openness and that curiosity, even though she didn't call the police, even though she's not telling us the whole story in the first visit, even though she's angry, even though she's drinking with the perpetrator, that very much if we go out looking for these things, then we're gonna be surprised and amazed at the acts of resistance we find, the protective capacity we find, and it's going to make it much easier for us to partner with her. The last thing that we talk about practice principles is looking at how do we intervene with perpetrators, and how do we use all the tools at our disposal to actually focus on how do you hold them accountable, how do you intervene with him to make changes. So I'm gonna come around to this. I've got about 7 minutes. Just so you know, they have 2 monitors for me. They've got one clock over there that says 7 minutes, and another one here on the podium that says low, and I'm trying to figure out what low means. Does it mean low energy? Does it mean you're low on time? Never mind. So I think I've got 7 minutes, 6 minutes before I go, but I want you to just see a couple things. I want to kind of give you a couple of more kind of tips about things. But just to really remember that if we're going to shift our practice, we have to be able to reflect critically on where we've been. And this is a quick rubric to think about where you are and the problems with this, because the way we approach women impacts the way we approach men and vice versa. And that these three categories of, they're all one-dimensional, but they're three different categories. He's either invisible, we don't do anything with him, and then all the focus on the mom. He's a good guy, which just means he shows up on time for appointments, says he loves his kids, seems interested, invested, but that's not a behavioral assessment of being a good guy, a good parent. And he's welcome and rewarded. There's no real assessment of his parenting. And her efforts are valued less. And then the bad guy, which often is shaped by racism, by classism, by criminal history, that they're easy to punish or throw away, and that still all the attention's on the mom. So really see if, in your practice, if this reflects anything that's familiar to you. So when we shift into a domestic violence-informed practice and we use a perpetrator pattern-based approach, we're looking at the behaviors of the perpetrator, not the relationship status or the survivor's behavior as the source of the domestic abuse and child risk and safety concerns. We're really looking at what he's done, not what she's doing. So I want you to think about how many meetings you started in where somebody said, well, we've got a case with domestic violence in it, and mom won't leave the relationship. And that's the opening line. And I want you to think about how different it would be if the opening line of that conversation or presentation to your team leader was, we've got this domestic violence case, and we've got this father who's gang involved, who's been violent to his last three partners, who's physically abused his other kids, and the most recent incident came because he kidnapped his children and threatened to not give them back unless she gave him money for meth. Would that be a very different conversation than if it came in and said, mom's a serial victim, she's a trauma survivor. We've had 4 open cases on her with 2 different men. Where does that case discussion go versus the other one? So the language, the framing, so if you think about back to the focus on group supervision, that to use this kind of languaging and framework to really shape the way the conversations go. And I would invite you to say that next time you're in group supervision, you start that up, and domestic violence is being presented, make sure, or jointly kind of make sure that the conversation starts with, what did the perpetrator do? And what its impact was on child and family functioning. And I think I'd offer up, because this is me integrating what you guys did this morning, that you could come at it from this curiosity and exploration of the survivor's resistance. But at the end of the day, if you're looking at the source of the danger to the children, you've got to be able to stand in what the danger statement, the harm statement's got to start with. This is what the domestic violence perpetrator did, and this is what it means for the kids. If you can't do that, then I'm not sure how you can engage in domestic violence-informed practice. So I want to just give you this bit here as another way to kind of think about this, what I'm talking about. This really, for me, ties back into the gender double standards. Because when we had this broader understanding of how perpetrators' behaviors harm children and families, including the adult survivor, obviously, then we're more likely to hold them accountable and to tell the narrative through the lens of what he's done to child and family functioning. So much of the work has been around that top middle part, which is children's trauma and safety. I think we're pretty good at, or best at, describing, did the kids get hurt? What did they see? What was dangerous around the incident of violence? But when you start moving outside that and start thinking about how well do we describe the loss of income to the family because of the perpetrator's behavior. And if I was in a different setting, I'd be asking you this back and forth, but you start thinking about, he lost his job because of his violence, because he kept going to court. She lost her job because she didn't want to show up with bruises. She lost her job because she was forced to move because of the violence. If you start thinking about all the different ways kids are affected in terms of economics by the perpetrator's behavior, and then you say, where is that showing up in our conversations with families? Where is it showing up in my documentation? That the perpetrator's behavior caused the family to move 3 times in the last 2 years. Because what we know is that what often gets written down when we look at family ecology is mom was unable to maintain safe and stable housing for the kids. Do you see the tie-in back to gender? that what we end up doing is especially when we widen out the impact of domestic violence to kids' mental health, to getting to counseling, to interference with medical care, to housing, to safe home environments, to educational neglect, often the person who's blamed for kids' needs not being met is usually the mother. So this multiple pathways to harm framework helps us really frame, well, what did he do to affect her mental health? What did he do to interfere with her going to counseling? What did he do to interfere or cause her substance abuse? I remember a case I worked on where the father, there were two kids from a previous relationship that were living with him and his girlfriend. She was pregnant with his child. And what he did was she was trying to recover from drinking and marijuana, I think. And what ended up happening is he said to her, that room that your kids are living in, that's going to be the room for my son. So he kept bringing drugs to the house, kept pressuring her, and then when she used, he actually physically drove her to the child protection office and said, here she is, she's using again, and we took the kids from her. So it's really important to be able to see how the domestic violence perpetrator's behavior filters through the family in all these different ways and impacts child and family functioning. So I'm getting a blinking light in two different places. Is that what that means? Time's up? Is that somebody? Catherine's saying, yes, your time's up. So I'm going to run a little bit over my time and then cut into the question and answer for about 5 minutes. But what I really wanted you to see is this assessment. Think about this assessment, which is that we assess mothers and fathers differently. So again, I'm weaving together the way we work with men who are not violent and families without violence with families with violence. And I want you to think about if this is accurate, that where we've been is we focus on mothers and we ask questions about their parenting skills, whether their substance use affects their parenting, how their mental health, their depression affects their parenting, how their relationship choices affect their parenting, right? We're often going and asking mom, are you in a new relationship? Is this person safe for you? Are they safe for the kids? Are they good at meeting the kids' basic needs? Are they good at using their kin network for childcare? Are their employment choices consistent with being a good parent? What I always call this one is don't be a stripper. But we're often looking at women's employment as it relates to being a parent, correct? And how much time are they out of the home? All these things, right? Childcare choices, is she making good childcare choices? And is she being a good co-parent? What I'm offering up to you is the way we approach assessing men and families, if we do it at all, is very different. Does he have a job? If he has a criminal history, does it get in the way of him working? If he has substance abuse issues, does it get in the way of him working? If he has mental health issues, does it get in the way of him working? And that we don't ask the same questions, for instance, around dad's substance abuse as it interferes with his parenting as the same we ask questions about moms. So I just want to offer you that what would our work look if this was really the way we approached men and men's roles in families. And we started asking questions about what his parenting skills are. We started asking questions, if he's a substance user, about how his kids are affected by his substance abuse and how his substance abuse may or may not get in the way of his parenting. What if we started asking questions about his depression or his anxiety and how it's affecting the family and how it functions? What if we're asking him questions about how he picked his new girlfriend and whether he thought his new girlfriend was going to be a good parent to his children? We ask those questions of moms all the time. What would it be like if we start paying attention to that? Now, again, I'm going to make the connection back to domestic violence, because isn't it interesting what we know about perpetrators? They often groom their new victim by telling her she's a better person, a better parent, a better partner than his kid's mother. Now, I want you to think about that for a second. What kind of parenting choice is it, if you're that man, to pit the mother of your children against your new girlfriend? If you looked at that through a parenting lens, would you see that as a good parenting choice or a bad parenting choice? Right? So I want you to start feeling what it means to weave together these higher standards and expectations for men as parents. What does he do to keep the kids' basic needs met? How does he support their basic needs being met? How does he use his kin network to support good parenting? What would it mean if you asked him as a long-distance trucker, or he's working FIFO, that he's away. What is that like for him and his kids if he's away 2 weeks at a time or a month at a time? Explore those relationships. Same thing around childcare and co-parenting. And what I'm going to suggest to you, that if you started weaving this into your day-to-day practice with families, you're going to uncover more domestic violence. You're going to find more, because you're going to ask questions like, well, talk to me about how you show your kids you respect their mother. Not, is there any domestic violence in the household? And that if you start approaching this in this way, you're going to start thinking about, am I asking all these questions about men and child and family functioning? And you're going to get a feeling for more how to talk to men. You get a feeling more of how to talk to women about their male partners. You get a better feeling how to talk to kids about the male caregivers in their life. And all those things are going to help you work with men around violence and make you feel more comfortable. So I'm going to skip a whole bunch of things that I wanted to talk about, but impossible in 15 minutes. I'm sure I'll be making the slides available. But I'm excited to say that we'll be doing e-learning courses with facts, that some of this material will be available online going forward. Want to invite people to Texas to our conference? Okay. You may not come to Texas in October. But a little more seriously, we are doing our Asia Pacific conference in Melbourne in February again with Berry Street. And these dates are pretty close to set. So you may want to do that. And I'll leave this up here for contact information. So I'm going to stop now. And you're coming up, Nicole, you're coming up to ask questions. So thank you all very much. I'm going to stay up here and take a few questions.